Sometimes the person who changes your life forever is the last one you'd ever expect to love. Sometimes what feels like the end of your world is actually the beginning of everything you never knew you needed. In 1884 Montana, schoolteacher Clara Whitmore thought she knew exactly what her future held until mountain man Elias Boone took her into the wilderness. What happened over those 120 days would teach them both that the heart doesn't follow the rules we set for it. But what drove a feared mountain man to risk everything for one woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass bell of Millbrook's one-room schoolhouse had chimed at 8 o'clock sharp every weekday morning for 3 years. And Clara Whitmore took pride in that unwavering consistency. She believed in order, in routine, in the civilizing power of education delivered with patience and firm kindness. At 31, she had carved out a respectable place for herself in this frontier town, earning the respect of parents who initially doubted whether an unmarried woman from back east could handle their unruly children. Clara's mornings began before dawn in her small apartment above Henley's general store. She would dress carefully in one of her 3 proper teaching dresses today, the navy wool with the white collar, and pin her auburn hair into a neat chignon. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a face that was pleasant rather than beautiful, with intelligent hazel eyes and a mouth that smiled easily at her students but remained serious when dealing with their parents. She had learned that frontier folk respected competence over charm, and competence she had in abundance. The walk to the schoolhouse took her past the heart of Millbrook, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around the main street like children gathering around their teacher's desk. She nodded to Mrs. Henley sweeping her front porch, to old Pete Manning loading supplies for his ranch, to the handful of early risers who made up the backbone of this small community. They had accepted her, these practical people, because she had proven herself useful and because she asked nothing of them beyond the respect due to their children's teacher. Clara paused at the schoolhouse door as she did every morning, her hand resting on the small gold locket at her throat. Inside were daguerreotypes of her parents, her father stern in his minister's collar, her mother gentle-eyed in her best dress. They had died of fever when Clara was 17, leaving her with enough money for an education but little else. The teaching college back in Pennsylvania had prepared her for many things, but not for the loneliness that could settle over a person like mountain snow, quiet and persistent. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara lit the oil lamps and checked the stove. The morning light filtered through windows that needed washing, casting rectangles of gold across the worn wooden floors. 16 desks sat in neat rows, each one representing a child she was determined to prepare for a world larger than Millbrook. Some would stay and work their families' ranches, but others might find their way to cities, to colleges, to lives their parents could barely imagine. That possibility made her work feel sacred. The first students arrived as she was writing the day's arithmetic problems on the blackboard. Little Sarah Morrison, barely 6, with pigtails that never stayed straight and a gap-toothed smile that could melt the sternest heart. Behind her came the Henderson twins, Peter and Paul, 10 years old, and already showing signs they'd rather be breaking horses than passing sentences. One by one, her small kingdom filled with the voices and energy of childhood. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," they chorused as she rang the bell, and she felt the familiar warmth of purpose settle over her like a comfortable shawl. The morning lessons flowed with practiced ease. Reading for the younger children, mathematics for the older ones, geography that expanded their world beyond the mountains that ringed their valley. Clara moved among the desks, guiding, encouraging, occasionally correcting with a gentle but firm hand. These children were her life's work, and she poured herself into each lesson with the dedication her father had once shown to his sermons. During the noon recess, while the children played outside, Clara sat at her desk with a cup of tea, and allowed herself to think about the letter she had received the previous week. Her cousin Margaret in Philadelphia had written with news of the family and, more pointedly, with suggestions about Clara's future. "You cannot mean to spend your entire life teaching other people's children in that wilderness," Margaret had written in her precise hand. "There are opportunities here, Clara. Mr. Davidson at the Academy speaks highly of your letters about frontier education. He believes you could secure a position at one of the better schools here, perhaps even write about your experiences. You could have a real life again, with society, with prospects for marriage to a gentleman of education and means." Clara folded the letter and tucked it away, as she had done every day since its arrival. Margaret meant well, but she could not understand that this was a real life. These children, this community, this sense of being needed and useful, it might not be the life Clara had once imagined, but it had become hers in ways that mattered. The afternoon brought history and composition, subjects that allowed Clara to share her love of learning with students who might never see the inside of a library. She told them stories of great leaders and distant lands, of scientific discoveries and artistic achievements. Their eyes would widen with wonder, and she would remember why she had chosen this path, why she had traveled so far from everything familiar to make a difference in lives that might otherwise remain narrow and unexamined. As the shadows lengthened and the school day drew to a close, Clara felt the familiar satisfaction of work well done. The children filed out one by one, calling their goodbyes, their voices fading as they scattered to their various homes. Soon, only the echo of their laughter remained, and the schoolhouse settled into the peaceful quiet that Clara treasured almost as much as the busy hours of teaching. She was cleaning the blackboard when she heard the heavy footsteps on the porch. Parents sometimes came by after hours to discuss their children's progress, so she wasn't alarmed. She set down her cloth and smoothed her skirts, preparing to welcome whoever had come calling. The door opened, and Clara looked up to see a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. The man standing in her doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that framed a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were rough, homespun, practical rather than fashionable, and his boots were scuffed from hard use. But it was his eyes that held her attention, pale blue like winter sky, and steady in a way that suggested he was accustomed to measuring everything he saw. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by disuse or perhaps by the thin mountain air. "My name is Elias Boone." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air seeping through the open door. She had heard that name spoken in whispers around Millbrook, usually accompanied by quick glances over shoulders and the kind of nervous laughter that people used to ward off things they didn't want to think about too carefully. Elias Boone, the mountain man who lived somewhere up in the high country. Elias Boone, who came to town perhaps twice a year for supplies and spoke to no one if he could help it. Elias Boone, who some claimed had killed a man back east before disappearing into the wilderness. "Mr. Boone," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm afraid the children have all gone home. If you have business with the school—" "My business is with you," he said, and took a step into the room. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat, a gesture that had comforted her since childhood. The small weight of it reminded her of who she was, where she came from, the civilized world that had shaped her. She was an educated woman, a teacher, a person of standing in this community. She was not someone who could simply be intimidated by a man's size or reputation. "Then please state your business, Mr. Boone. I have work to finish before." "You're coming with me," he said simply, as if he were commenting on the weather. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Clara almost laughed. "I beg your pardon. You're coming with me," he repeated, and this time there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a request. "Now, Miss Whitmore, we have a long way to travel before dark." Clara's mind reeled, trying to make sense of what was happening. In all her years of teaching, she had dealt with difficult parents, unruly children, and the occasional drunk cowboy who wandered into town looking for trouble. But this was something entirely different. This was a situation for which her careful upbringing and proper education had provided no preparation. "Mr. Boone, I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. I cannot simply leave with you. I have responsibilities here, obligations to my students and this community. If you need assistance with something, perhaps the sheriff." "No, Sheriff," Elias said quietly, and took another step closer. Clara noticed that despite his size and obvious strength, he moved with careful control, like a man accustomed to being mindful of his impact on smaller creatures. "And no misunderstanding. You'll come willing, or I'll carry you. Your choice." The casual way he spoke those words, as if offering her tea or commenting on the weather, sent a jolt of real fear through Clara's body. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle difficult situations with reason and calm authority. Frontier life had taught her to be practical, to think clearly under pressure. But standing here in her own schoolhouse, facing this imposing stranger who spoke of carrying her away as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she felt her careful composure beginning to crack. "You cannot be serious," she said, backing toward her desk. "This is 1884. Mr. Boone, not the Dark Ages. You cannot simply take a woman against her will. There are laws." "Laws," he repeated, and something flickered in those pale eyes. "Yes, Miss Whitmore, there are laws, and sometimes they work the way they're supposed to, and sometimes they don't. Today, they don't matter." Clara's hand found the edge of her desk, and she gripped it for support. The familiar weight of the small gold locket at her throat felt heavier now, a tangible connection to the civilized world that suddenly seemed very far away. Her parents had raised her to believe in order, in justice, in the power of reason to resolve conflicts. They had taught her that good people could trust in institutions, in society, in the basic decency of their fellow human beings. Standing here face to face with Elias Boone, Clara began to understand that her parents' world, the world of churches and schools and proper society, might not extend as far into the frontier as she had believed. "My students," she said, grasping for something that might reach whatever humanity lay behind those watchful eyes. "Tomorrow is Friday. They'll be expecting their weekly examinations. And the Harvest Festival is next week. The children have been preparing recitations. You cannot ask me to abandon them without explanation." "I'm not asking," Elias said simply. Clara felt a flash of anger cut through her fear. "Then what kind of man are you? What kind of person takes a schoolteacher away from children who depend on her? What possible reason could you have for such cruelty?" For just a moment, something shifted in Elias's expression. The hard set of his jaw softened almost imperceptibly, and Clara caught a glimpse of what might have been regret, or perhaps pain, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "The kind of man who does what he has to do," he said. "Now collect whatever you need for a journey. We leave in 5 minutes." "I won't do it," Clara said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I won't simply walk away from my life because a stranger commands it." "If you mean to take me by force, then you'll have to do exactly that, Mr. Boone. But I will not cooperate in my own kidnapping." Elias studied her for a long moment, and Clara had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing far more than she wanted to reveal. She was frightened, terrified, if she was honest, but she was also angry, and beneath the anger was something she hadn't expected. A strange sort of curiosity about this man who had walked into her orderly world and shattered it with a few quiet words. "Kidnapping," he said, as if testing the word. "I suppose that's what you'd call it. What would you call it?" "Necessary," he said, and moved toward her with that same careful control she had noticed before. Clara considered running, but there was nowhere to go. The schoolhouse had only one door, and Elias stood between her and it. The windows were too high and too small, and even if she could reach one, she was wearing her good teaching dress with its proper corset and full skirts. She was not dressed for climbing or running or any of the things a woman might need to do if her life suddenly stopped making sense. Instead, she stood her ground and met his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster. If this was to be her fate, she would face it as her parents had taught her, with courage, with principle, and with faith that somehow, in ways she could not yet see, justice would prevail. Elias reached her desk and stopped, close enough now that she could smell the mountain air on his clothes, the scent of pine and wood smoke, and something wilder that spoke of places far from civilization. Close enough to see that his hands, large and calloused as they were, moved with surprising gentleness as he picked up her teaching slate from the desk. "You'll want this," he said, offering it to her. "Where we're going, there won't be much else to do in the evenings." Clara stared at the slate, confusion mingling with her fear. "I don't understand." "You will," Elias said. "Time comes, you'll understand everything. But that time's not now." He moved past her toward the corner where she kept her cloak hanging on its peg. When he lifted it down and turned back to her, holding it open in a gesture that was somehow both threatening and courteous, Clara felt the last of her illusions about her safe, predictable life slip away like smoke. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was gentler now, though no less determined. "I know this is hard. I know it's not what you want. But fighting me won't change what has to happen, and it'll only make the journey more difficult for both of us." Clara looked at her schoolhouse, at the neat rows of desks where her students would sit tomorrow, expecting her to be there to guide them through their lessons. At the blackboard where she had written thousands of arithmetic problems and grammar exercises and inspiring quotes meant to broaden young minds. At the brass bell that had marked the rhythm of her days for 3 years, the bell that tomorrow would ring without her hand to pull its rope. She thought of Margaret's letter, still tucked away in her desk drawer, with its talk of real life and proper society and gentlemen of education and means. Perhaps her cousin had been right after all. Perhaps this wilderness existence had been nothing more than an elaborate way of avoiding the truth about what her life was meant to become. With movements that felt disconnected from her will, Clara allowed Elias to help her into her cloak. His hands were careful as he fastened the clasp at her throat, mindful not to disturb the chain of her locket. When he was finished, he stepped back and regarded her with those pale, unreadable eyes. "Ready?" he asked, as if they were about to take a pleasant afternoon stroll. Clara looked around her schoolhouse one last time, memorizing details she had never thought to notice. The way the late afternoon light slanted across the floor, the smell of chalk dust and children's pencils, the profound quiet that settled over the room when learning was taking place. Then she lifted her chin and met Elias Boone's gaze with all the dignity she could summon. "I suppose I have no choice," she said. "No," he agreed quietly. "You don't." The leather gloves that Elias wore smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, scents that would forever remind Clara of the moment her orderly world ended. As he guided her from the schoolhouse with a firm but careful hand on her elbow, she caught the aroma clinging to the worn leather and wondered absurdly if she would remember this detail years from now, assuming she lived to have years ahead of her. Outside, a horse waited, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and the kind of patient demeanor that spoke of long trails and trusted partnership. Elias lifted Clara onto the saddle with an ease that reminded her uncomfortably of how small and helpless she was compared to his mountain-hardened strength. When he swung up behind her, she felt dwarfed by his presence, acutely aware of his solid warmth at her back and the controlled power in the arms that reached around her to take the reins. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, as they rode past the edge of town, her voice barely steady. "Into the mountains," he replied, and offered nothing more. Clara twisted in the saddle to look back at Millbrook, watching the familiar buildings grow smaller with each step of the horse's steady gait. Someone would notice her absence eventually. Mrs. Henley would wonder why Clara hadn't returned to her apartment above the store. The children would arrive Monday morning to find the schoolhouse dark and empty. The sheriff would be called, search parties organized, Surely civilization would not simply allow one of its own to disappear without consequence. But as the town faded behind them and the wilderness rose ahead in all its vast indifference, Clara began to understand how small and fragile the structures of law and order really were. Out here, beyond the reach of sheriffs and proper society, a man like Elias Boone could do whatever he pleased, and there might be no one to stop him. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, following a path that seemed to exist more in Elias's mind than on the actual ground. Clara had never ventured far from town. Her world had been bounded by the schoolhouse, the general store, and the boarding house where she took her meals. Now she found herself climbing into country she had only glimpsed from a distance, where the air grew thin and the silence was broken only by the whisper of wind through branches and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves on stone. As the afternoon wore on, Clara's initial terror began to give way to a different kind of fear, one mixed with unwilling fascination. She had read about wilderness in books, had taught her students about the explorers and mountain men who had opened the frontier. But experiencing it firsthand was something altogether different. The scale of it was overwhelming, the sense of being utterly dwarfed by forces beyond human control or understanding. "Why?" she asked again as they paused beside a stream to water the horse. "Why me?" Elias helped her down from the saddle, his gloved hands gentle despite their obvious strength. For a moment he seemed to consider her question, his pale eyes studying her face as if weighing how much truth she could bear. "Because you were there," he said finally. "Because sometimes a man doesn't get to choose his path, only how he walks it." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you right now." Clara wanted to argue, to demand the explanation she deserved, but something in his tone warned her that pushing would accomplish nothing. Instead, she knelt beside the stream and cupped the cold mountain water in her hands, drinking deeply and trying to calm the panic that fluttered in her chest like a caged bird. When she looked up, she found Elias watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was wariness there, and determination, but also something that might have been regret. For just a moment, she saw past the intimidating exterior to the man beneath, and what she saw surprised her. He didn't look like a criminal or a madman. He looked like someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. "How long?" she asked. "How long do you mean to keep me?" "As long as it takes. As long as what takes." But Elias had already turned away, checking the horse's tack with the kind of methodical attention to detail that spoke of long experience in country where small mistakes could prove fatal. Clara watched his hands move over the leather straps, noting the care he took to ensure everything was secure. Even his gloves showed signs of meticulous maintenance, stitched and restitched where the wear was heaviest, oiled to keep the leather supple despite hard use. They mounted again and continued climbing as the sun sank lower toward the western peaks. Clara found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, trying to memorize landmarks that might help her find her way back if she ever got the chance to escape. But the deeper they went into the mountains, the more she realized how hopeless such thoughts were. This was Elias's domain, a world he knew as intimately as she knew her schoolhouse, and she was as lost here as he would be trying to pass Latin grammar or solve algebraic equations. As darkness began to gather in the valleys below, they reached a small clearing where Elias finally called a halt. He helped Clara down from the horse and began making camp with the same quiet efficiency he had shown all day. She watched him work, noting how he positioned their small fire to be invisible from below, how he picketed the horse where it could graze but not wander, how he arranged their simple supplies with an economy of motion that spoke of countless nights spent under the stars. "There's jerky and hardtack," he said, offering her a portion of their meager meal. "I know it's not what you're used to." Clara accepted the food without comment, though the dried meat was tough and the hardtack nearly broke her teeth. She was hungrier than she had expected, and the simple fact of eating helped settle some of the wild fear that had been coursing through her all day. "You can sleep," Elias said when they had finished eating. "I'll keep watch." "Watch for what?" "Whatever needs watching for." Clara wrapped her cloak more tightly around herself and tried to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. Above them, stars were beginning to appear in numbers that put the modest display visible from Millbrook to shame. She had never seen so many, never realized how vast and indifferent the universe really was. Lying there in the wilderness, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life, and yet, paradoxically, more aware of herself, of her own breathing, her own heartbeat, her own stubborn determination to survive whatever ordeal lay ahead. "Mr. Boone," she said into the darkness. "What?" "I want you to know that whatever you're planning, whatever reason you have for taking me, it won't work. I'm not the kind of woman who breaks easily." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. "No," he said quietly, "I don't suppose you are." Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind raced with questions and fears, and the growing certainty that her life had changed irrevocably in the space of a single afternoon. Whatever happened next, she would never again be the same woman who had rung the school bell that morning and settled into another day of comfortable routine. In the firelight, she could see Elias sitting motionless against a tree, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of warmth and light. His gloves lay beside him on the ground, and she noticed that his hands, freed from their leather covering, were surprisingly elegant, long-fingered and careful, the hands of someone who created as well as destroyed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new revelations about the man who had stolen her away from everything familiar. But tonight, exhausted by the day's upheaval and lulled by the vast silence of the mountains, Clara finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her hand clutched around the small gold locket that remained her only tangible connection to the world she had lost. The wooden spoon that Elias carved during Clara's first week of captivity was a simple thing, hewn from mountain ash with careful practiced strokes that spoke of evenings spent in quiet concentration. Clara found herself watching his hands as he worked by firelight, noting the way he tested each curve with his thumb, how he sanded the surface smooth with a piece of rough stone until it felt like silk against the palm. Her first week as his prisoner had been a careful dance of defiance and survival. Each morning, Clara tested the boundaries of her captivity, probing for weaknesses in both Elias's vigilance and the mountain fortress that held her. She studied their daily route, memorizing landmarks and calculating distances. She observed his habits, looking for patterns that might give her an advantage. But with each passing day, the harsh reality of her situation became more clear. She was completely at the mercy of a man who seemed to know these mountains as intimately as she knew the alphabet. The cabin, when they finally reached it on the third day, was not what Clara had expected. She had imagined something crude and temporary, the kind of rough shelter a fugitive might throw together for basic protection from the elements. Instead, she found herself looking at a structure that spoke of permanence and care, logs fitted with precision, chinking tight against winter winds, windows positioned to catch the morning light. It sat on a natural terrace overlooking a valley that stretched away toward distant peaks, as isolated and beautiful as anything she had ever seen. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, as Elias helped her down from the horse. 5 years, he replied, leading the animal toward a small stable that was as well built as the cabin itself. 5 years alone? Mostly. Clara studied the cabin with new eyes, trying to reconcile the man who had kidnapped her with the person who had built this place. The structure showed a patience and attention to detail that seemed at odds with the impulsive criminal she had imagined him to be. The porch was swept clean, the woodpile stacked with geometric precision, the small garden plot weeded and tended with obvious care. Inside, the cabin was even more surprising. The main room was dominated by a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space, with comfortable furniture arranged to take advantage of both the warmth and the view through the windows. Books lined one wall, not many, but more than she would have expected from a man living in self-imposed exile. The kitchen area was compact but well organized, with hand-forged tools hanging from hooks and shelves lined with jars of preserved food. "You'll sleep there," Elias said, indicating a small alcove separated from the main room by a heavy curtain. "It's private." Clara pulled the curtain aside and found a narrow space furnished with a simple bed, a washstand, and a trunk for storage. It was clean and spare, but not uncomfortable. On the small table beside the bed, someone had placed a few wildflowers in a mason jar, a touch of beauty that seemed incongruous coming from her captor. "Did you do this?" she asked, gesturing toward the flowers. Elias glanced at the arrangement and nodded briefly. "Thought you might like them." The simple kindness of the gesture unsettled Clara more than threats might have done. She had prepared herself to hate this man, to resist him with every fiber of her being. But small acts of consideration made it harder to maintain her anger, even as they raised disturbing questions about his motives and character. That first night in the cabin, Clara lay awake, listening to the sounds of her new prison, the settling of logs, the whisper of wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, hunting in the darkness. Through the thin wall, she could hear Elias moving quietly about his evening routines, banking the fire and securing the door. There was a rhythm to his movements that spoke of long solitude, of a man accustomed to taking care of himself in a place where carelessness could prove fatal. The next morning, she woke to find breakfast waiting on the table, fried eggs from chickens she hadn't noticed the day before, fresh bread still warm from the oven, coffee strong enough to cut through the mountain chill. Elias was nowhere to be seen, but through the window she could observe him working in the garden, his movements economical and sure as he tended rows of vegetables that would see him through the coming winter. "Thank you," she said when he came inside, gesturing toward the meal. He nodded and poured himself coffee, settling into a chair across from her with the kind of easy silence that suggested he was comfortable with his own company. Clara studied his face in the morning light, noting details she had missed during the drama of her kidnapping. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and a scar along his jaw that had healed white against his weathered skin. His hair was longer than fashion dictated, but clean and well kept, and when he moved, there was a fluid grace that reminded her of the wild animals she sometimes glimpsed from the schoolhouse windows. "How old are you?" she asked suddenly. 40. "Married?" Something flickered in his pale eyes. "Was. What happened to her?" "She died." The simple finality of his answer discouraged further questions, but Clara filed the information away. A widower, then? Perhaps that explained something about his isolation, his obvious skill at domestic tasks that many men left to their wives. Over the following days, Clara settled into a routine that was both maddening and oddly comforting. Elias would rise before dawn to tend his animals and check his traps, leaving her alone in the cabin with access to his books and the freedom to move about the immediate area. She quickly discovered that escape was impossible. The cabin sat at the end of a box canyon with sheer walls on 3 sides and only one way out, a narrow trail that Elias could easily monitor from his daily work. She spent hours studying that trail, looking for alternate routes that might lead to freedom. But the more she learned about the terrain, the more she understood how completely trapped she was. Even if she could slip away unnoticed, she had no idea how to navigate the maze of canyons and ridges that surrounded them. Without proper equipment and extensive knowledge of the country, she would likely die of exposure before she found her way back to civilization. So instead of futile escape attempts, Clara began to study her captor with the same intensity she had once brought to lesson planning. She watched him work, noting his methodical approach to every task. She observed his interactions with the animals, seeing how they responded to his quiet commands with trust and affection. She listened to him move about the cabin in the evenings, hearing in his careful footsteps the consideration of a man who was accustomed to sharing space with someone else. It was during one of these evening observations that she first saw him carving the wooden spoon. He sat by the fire with a piece of mountain ash across his knees, his knife moving in careful, precise strokes as he shaped the wood to his purpose. There was something meditative about the way he worked, as if the act of creation helped quiet whatever thoughts occupied his mind during the long mountain nights. "May I watch?" Clara asked one evening, stepping closer to the fire. Elias glanced up from his work, considering her request. After a moment, he nodded toward the chair across from him. "If you want." Clara settled into the chair and watched his hands move over the wood. The spoon was taking shape under his careful attention, its bowl deepening with each stroke, its handle smoothing into an elegant curve that would fit comfortably in the palm. It was beautiful work, far more refined than the utilitarian tool she had expected. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "My father taught me, said a man should be able to make what he needs with his own hands." "What else did he teach you?" Elias paused in his carving, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "How to read the weather, how to track game, how to tell when someone's lying to you." The last comment hung in the air between them, and Clara wondered if it was meant as a warning or simply an observation. She watched him return to his work, noting the way his scarred hands moved with surprising delicacy over the wood. "It's beautiful," she said, when he finally set the finished spoon aside. "It's functional," he corrected, but she caught the hint of pleasure in his voice. That night, as Clara lay in her narrow bed listening to the mountain silence, she found herself thinking about the man who had carved a beautiful spoon for no reason other than the satisfaction of creating something useful and lovely. It was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile that person with the dangerous criminal she had expected him to be. Whatever Elias Boone was, whatever he had done to earn his fearsome reputation, he was proving to be far more complex than she had imagined. And that complexity, Clara was beginning to realize, made him infinitely more dangerous than any simple villain could ever be. The pressed wildflower fell from the pages of a worn copy of Emerson's essays like a whispered secret, its delicate petals still holding traces of purple, despite the months or perhaps years it had spent hidden between discussions of self-reliance and the oversoul. Clara discovered it during her second week of captivity, when boredom had driven her to explore Elias's small collection of books more thoroughly than propriety might normally have allowed. She had been searching for something to occupy her mind during the long afternoon hours, when Elias was away, checking his traplines. The books were an eclectic mix, volumes of poetry sitting beside practical guides to animal husbandry, philosophical treatises, neighboring field guides to local flora. Each book showed signs of careful handling, with margins filled with notes written in Elias's surprisingly educated hand. The discovery that her captor was not only literate, but well-read, added another layer to the puzzle of who he really was. The pressed flower was tucked between pages, discussing the importance of trusting one's inner voice. And Clara couldn't help but wonder about the circumstances that had led Elias to preserve it there. Had it marked a passage that held special meaning for him? Was it a memento of some significant moment? Or perhaps it was simply the gesture of a man who found beauty in small things, even in the midst of whatever circumstances had driven him to this isolated existence. Clara was still holding the book when she heard Elias's boots on the porch. Quickly, she slipped the flower back between the pages and returned the volume to its place on the shelf, but not before noticing that her hands were trembling slightly. The small discovery had unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite name, adding a dimension of vulnerability to her image of the mountain man that made her own situation feel even more precarious. "Reading?" Elias asked as he entered, noting the book she still held. "You have quite a collection," Clara replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. I wouldn't have expected. Expected what? Nothing. I simply meant that you're obviously well educated. It's surprising to find such books in a place like this. Elias hung his coat on a peg by the door and moved to stoke the fire. Why surprising? You think education and wilderness are incompatible? Not incompatible, exactly. But most people who choose to live in isolation, most people who choose, he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Clara realize she had touched on dangerous ground. They ate their evening meal in relative silence, but Clara found herself studying Elias more intently than before. The pressed flower had humanized him in ways that frightened her, suggesting depths of feeling and sensitivity that made it harder to maintain the emotional distance she needed for her own protection. It was easier to hate a crude criminal than to understand a complex man driven by circumstances she couldn't yet fathom. The revelation that her captor might be capable of romantic sentiment, for what else could explain a preserved flower in a book of poetry, opened uncomfortable questions about his intentions toward her. So far, he had treated her with surprising consideration. But Clara had read enough sensation novels to know that such consideration often came with a price. The thought that Elias might be developing feelings for her, or expecting her to develop feelings for him, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. That night, she lay awake, listening to the sounds of his restless movement in the main room. Usually, Elias settled into sleep as efficiently as he did everything else, but tonight she could hear him pacing, the soft scrape of his chair as he sat and stood again, the whisper of pages turning as he read by firelight. Something was troubling him, and Clara found herself wondering if her discovery of the flower had somehow disturbed his equilibrium as much as it had disturbed hers. The next morning brought the first signs of her own physical vulnerability. Clara woke with a headache and a scratchy throat that she initially attributed to the high altitude and dry mountain air. But as the day progressed, she began to feel truly unwell, feverish and weak, with aching joints that made every movement an effort. By evening, she could barely lift her head from the pillow, and her attempts to hide her condition from Elias proved futile. "You're sick," he said, appearing beside her bed with a cup of something that smelled strongly of herbs. "I'm fine," Clara managed, though her voice came out as little more than a whisper. "Drink this." She wanted to refuse, to maintain some vestige of independence even in her weakened state, but the practical part of her mind recognized that she needed help. With Elias's assistance, she managed to sit up enough to swallow the bitter tea, grimacing at its taste, but grateful for the warmth it brought to her chilled body. Over the following days, Clara drifted in and out of fevered consciousness, aware of Elias's presence, like a steady anchor in the storm of her illness. He brought her water when she was thirsty, broth when she could manage to swallow, cool cloths for her forehead when the fever spiked. His hands were gentle as he helped her sit up to drink, patient when the medicine made her stomach rebel, steadfast in their care, even when she was too delirious to appreciate his efforts. In her fevered dreams, Clara found herself back in the schoolhouse, trying to teach a lesson while her students' faces kept changing into Elias's weathered features. She dreamed of her parents, stern and disapproving, warning her about the dangers of trusting strangers. She dreamed of the pressed flower, growing and blooming until it filled the entire cabin with its purple petals, beautiful and suffocating at the same time. When the fever finally broke on the fourth day, Clara woke to find herself weak but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like weeks. Elias sat in a chair beside her bed, his head tilted back against the wall in exhausted sleep. In the morning light, she could see the toll her illness had taken on him, the deepened lines around his eyes, the stubble that suggested he had been too worried to bother with shaving, the way his clothes hung loose as if he had forgotten to eat while caring for her. The sight of his obvious concern stirred something in Clara's chest that she didn't want to examine too closely. It would be so much easier if he were simply a villain, someone she could hate without complication. But the man who had sat by her bedside through the worst of her fever, who had bathed her face with cool water and coaxed medicine down her throat with infinite patience, was not a simple villain. He was something far more complex and therefore far more dangerous to her peace of mind. "Thank you," she whispered, and saw his eyes open immediately, as if he had been waiting for her to wake. "How do you feel?" "Better. Weak, but better." Clara struggled to sit up, and Elias moved quickly to help her, arranging pillows behind her back with the same careful attention he had shown throughout her illness. "You nearly died," he said quietly. "Mountain fever takes some people that way, comes on fast and hard. If you hadn't been strong—" "But I was," Clara interrupted, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure him or herself. "I'm still here." "Yes," Elias said, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "You're still here." The weight of unspoken meaning in those words hung between them, and Clara found herself wondering what would have happened if she had died. Would Elias have grieved for her? Would he have buried her in this mountain wilderness with the same care he had shown in tending her illness? The thought should have been morbid, but instead it filled her with a confused mixture of gratitude and something that might have been tenderness. As her strength returned over the following days, Clara found herself seeing Elias with new eyes. She noticed how he moved more quietly around the cabin when she was resting, how he prepared foods he thought might tempt her recovering appetite, how he brought her books to read during the long hours of convalescence. The pressed flower she had discovered seemed to take on new significance, not just evidence of a sentimental nature, but proof of a capacity for nurturing and care that extended beyond mere duty. "Why did you save me?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. She wrapped in blankets, and he, carving another piece of wood with the same meditative concentration she had observed before. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one. You could have let the fever take me. It would have solved your problem, whatever that problem is." Elias set down his carving and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Is that what you think? That you're a problem to be solved? Aren't I?" "No," he said quietly. "You're not a problem, Clara Whitmore. You're—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. "You're someone who deserves to live." The use of her first name, spoken with unexpected gentleness, sent warmth through Clara's chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She found herself studying his face in the flickering light, noting the way his expression had softened, the hint of something that might have been affection in his pale eyes. It was a dangerous moment, pregnant with possibilities that Clara knew she should resist. But as she sat there in the warm cabin, surrounded by evidence of Elias's care and consideration, she found it increasingly difficult to remember why she should fear this man who had quite literally nursed her back from the edge of death. The pressed flower, hidden in its book of philosophy, seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be revealed, of depths in Elias Boone that Clara was only beginning to understand. And despite every rational thought that warned her against it, she found herself wanting to discover what other surprises lay hidden in the heart of the man who had stolen her away from everything familiar, yet somehow made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. The hunting knife that Elias carried had belonged to his father, and his father before him, its blade worn thin from years of careful sharpening and its bone handle polished smooth by generations of hands. Clara first glimpsed it during her third week of recovery, when Elias was preparing a rabbit for their dinner and she had grown strong enough to sit on the porch and watch him work. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something almost reverent in the way he handled the knife, as if it were a sacred object rather than a simple tool. When he caught her watching, he paused in his work and offered her a rare smile, not the guarded expression she had grown accustomed to, but something genuine and warm that transformed his weathered features completely. "My grandfather made this handle," he said, holding the knife so she could see the intricate scrimshaw work etched into the bone, carved it from the antler of the first elk he killed after coming west. Said a man's knife should tell his story. Clara leaned forward to examine the delicate engravings more closely. The images seemed to flow around the handle in an endless narrative: mountains and trees, wild animals and weather patterns, even tiny human figures engaged in various activities. It was beautiful work, far more artistic than she would have expected from a frontier hunter. "What's your story?" she asked without thinking, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. She had been trying to maintain some emotional distance from her captor, but moments like this made such distance increasingly difficult to preserve. Elias turned the knife in his hands, studying the carved surface as if seeing it for the first time. "Still being written, I suppose. Where does it begin?" "Ohio. Little farm outside Columbus. My father raised corn and cattle, figured his sons would do the same." Elias resumed his work on the rabbit, but his movements had slowed, as if talking about the past required most of his attention. "Had it all planned out, which fields we'd inherit, which girl I'd marry, how many grandchildren would carry on the family name. What changed? Everything." The word came out flat and final, discouraging further questions. But something in his tone, a note of old pain that had never quite healed, made Clara want to understand what had driven him so far from his intended path. Over the following days, as her strength continued to return, Clara found herself drawn into conversations that revealed pieces of Elias's history like fragments of a broken mirror. He had been educated. She learned not just in the practical skills of farming and hunting, but in literature and mathematics, and even some Latin. His father had believed in learning, had scraped together money for books, and hired a traveling teacher to ensure his sons could read and write properly. "Sounds like a good man," Clara said one evening as they shared their simple meal. "He was, old-fashioned, maybe, but good. Believed in doing right by people, in keeping your word, in standing up for what matters even when it costs you. Is that why you left? Because you stood up for something?" Elias's jaw tightened, and Clara thought he wouldn't answer. But after a long moment, he set down his fork and met her eyes across the rough wooden table. "I left because staying would have meant compromising everything he taught me. Sometimes a man has to choose between being safe and being right. And you chose to be right?" "I chose to try to be right, whether I succeeded," he shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. "That's not for me to judge." The conversation lingered in Clara's mind as she lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of Elias moving about his evening routines. She was beginning to understand that whatever had brought him to this mountain exile, it hadn't been a simple matter of criminality or cowardice. The man who carried his grandfather's knife and honored his father's memory was operating from a moral compass that might be unconventional, but it was undeniably present. As the days passed, Clara found herself taking on more responsibility around the cabin. Her recovery had left her restless and eager to contribute something useful rather than remain a burden on Elias's resources. She began helping with cooking and cleaning, organizing the small library, even tending the vegetable garden that would soon need harvesting before the first frost. Working alongside Elias in the garden, Clara discovered yet another dimension to his character. He knew the names of every plant, not just the cultivated vegetables, but the wild herbs and flowers that grew at the forest's edge. He could predict the weather by the behavior of birds and the feel of the wind, could read the mountain's moods in cloud formations and the quality of light. His connection to this place ran deeper than mere survival. It was an intimate understanding, born of years spent in careful observation and respectful coexistence. "You love it here," Clara said one afternoon as they worked side by side, harvesting the last of the summer beans. "Love's a strong word, but accurate?" Elias straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "It's peaceful, honest. Things are what they seem to be, and if you treat them with respect, they treat you the same way. Unlike people, unlike some people." Clara sensed the weight of history behind those words, but she was learning to recognize the boundaries of what Elias was willing to share. Instead of pressing for details, she returned to her work, letting the comfortable silence stretch between them as they filled their baskets with the fruits of his careful labor. It was during these quiet moments of shared work that Clara began to notice the subtle changes in their relationship. Elias's initial wariness had given way to something that might have been companionship, and she found herself responding to his rare smiles with genuine warmth rather than calculated politeness. When he taught her to identify edible plants or showed her how to read the signs that predicted changing weather, she listened with real interest rather than simply marking time until her next escape attempt. The realization that she was actually enjoying his company came as a shock that left Clara questioning everything she thought she knew about herself. She was a practical woman, a rational woman, someone who prided herself on making sensible decisions based on careful consideration of facts. Yet here she was, beginning to appreciate the company of the man who had kidnapped her, finding comfort in his steady presence and wisdom in his unconventional worldview. "I should hate you," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, the hunting knife resting on the table between them where Elias had been cleaning it after their meal. "Should you? Any rational person would. You've taken me from my life, my work, everything that mattered to me. You've made me a prisoner in this wilderness, with no explanation, no timeline for release, no consideration for my feelings or desires. That's all true. But I don't hate you." The admission came out quietly, almost whispered, as if speaking it aloud might make it more real than she was ready to accept. Elias looked up from the knife he had been polishing, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "Maybe that makes you a better person than most. Or maybe it makes me a fool. Could be both." Despite the gravity of their conversation, Clara found herself smiling at his dry humor. It was one of the things she had come to appreciate about Elias, his ability to find understated wit even in the darkest moments, his refusal to take himself too seriously despite the obvious weight of whatever burden he carried. "Tell me about her," Clara said suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the request. Her? Your wife, the woman who died." Elias set down the knife and stared into the fire for a long moment. Clara thought he would refuse to answer, as he had refused so many other personal questions, but when he finally spoke, his voice was soft with old grief. "Her name was Sarah Mitchell before she married me, Sarah Boone for 3 years after. She had hair the color of wheat in summer and a laugh that could make you forget every trouble you'd ever had." "How did you meet?" "Church social. She was the preacher's daughter, supposed to marry the banker's son and live a proper life in a proper house with proper everything. Instead, she fell for a farmer who read too much poetry and asked too many questions about things that were better left alone." Clara heard the pain in his voice and understood that she was being given a rare gift access to memories that Elias rarely shared, even with himself. She remained silent, afraid that any interruption might cause him to retreat back into his usual reserve. "She loved books," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the dancing flames. "Used to read to me in the evenings while I worked on the farm equipment. Said she wanted to see the world, all the places she'd read about in novels and travel accounts. I promised her we'd take a trip east for our 5th anniversary, maybe even go to Europe if we could save enough money. What happened to her? Fever. Same kind that nearly took you, but we didn't know how to treat it then. Didn't have the right herbs, the right knowledge. I watched her die over the course of a week, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it." The raw anguish in those words hit Clara like a physical blow. Suddenly, Elias's careful nursing during her own illness took on new meaning. He had saved her not just out of basic human decency, but because he couldn't bear to watch another woman die from the same disease that had claimed his wife. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "It was a long time ago. Grief doesn't follow time the way other things do." Elias looked at her then, and in his expression, Clara saw recognition of a shared understanding. She had lost her parents. He had lost his wife. Both of them knew what it meant to have the foundation of their world stripped away without warning, to be left adrift in a reality that no longer made sense. "Is that why you preserve flowers in books?" she asked gently. Because she loved to read? A flash of surprise crossed Elias's features, followed by something that might have been embarrassment. You found it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. I was just looking for something to read and it fell out. It's all right. Elias stood and moved to the bookshelf, retrieving the volume of Emerson she had been examining days earlier. He opened it to the page where the pressed flower lay like a purple ghost between discussions of self-reliance. Indian paintbrush. It was growing by the creek the day I finished building this cabin. Seemed like a sign that the place was ready to become a home. Have you been waiting for someone to share it with? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Clara wasn't sure she was ready to explore. But she found herself wanting to know the answer, wanting to understand whether her presence here was part of some larger plan or simply an unfortunate accident of circumstances. I stopped waiting for things a long time ago, Elias said finally. Now I just try to appreciate what comes for as long as it lasts. The hunting knife glinted on the table between them, its carved handle telling the story of generations who had lived and loved and lost in the great sweep of human experience. Clara found herself thinking about the stories that knife would tell if it could speak of her own grandfather, the man who had carved those intricate designs while dreaming of a future his grandson would never see. Your grandfather, she said, did he ever regret coming west? Don't know. He died when I was young. But my father used to say that regret was just another way of living in the past, and the past was the one place a man could never go back to, no matter how much he might want to. Wise man. In his way. Elias returned the book to its shelf and settled back into his chair by the fire. What about you? Any regrets about the life you left behind? Clara considered the question seriously, trying to separate her genuine feelings from the assumptions she thought she should have. Her life in Millbrook had been purposeful and meaningful, filled with work she valued and people she cared about. But it had also been solitary and predictable, bounded by expectations and conventions that she had never questioned until they were stripped away. I miss my students, she said honestly. I worry about them, wonder if they're getting the education they deserve, if they'll have the opportunities I was trying to give them. But I don't miss the loneliness as much as I thought I would, and I don't miss the feeling that I was living someone else's idea of what my life should be. It was the most honest answer she had given to any question since her capture, and the admission surprised her with its truth. Here in this mountain cabin, far from the civilized world that had shaped her expectations, Clara was discovering aspects of herself that she had never known existed. She was stronger than she had believed, more adaptable, more capable of finding contentment in simple things than her educated upbringing had suggested. Maybe your grandfather's knife is right, she said, looking at the worn implement with new appreciation. Maybe our stories are still being written, and we get to choose what happens in the next chapter. Elias followed her gaze to the knife, and for a moment something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of possibilities that neither of them was quite ready to name. The fire crackled in the silence, and outside the wind sang through the pines with the voice of wilderness that Clara was finally beginning to hear as music rather than threat. The teaching slate that Clara had brought from the schoolhouse became an unexpected bridge between their two worlds during the long evenings of her 6th week in the mountains. She had been using it to work through mathematical problems in her head, maintaining the mental discipline that had always been central to her identity as an educator. But when she noticed Elias struggling to read a particularly complex passage in one of his philosophy books, she found herself offering assistance without thinking about the implications. The words are all familiar, he said, frustration evident in his voice as he squinted at the page in the lamplight. But stringing them together into meaning, sometimes it's like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Clara set aside her own reading and moved closer to examine the text. It was a dense passage from Kant, full of abstract concepts and subordinate clauses that would challenge even an experienced reader. The fact that Elias was attempting such material spoke to both his intelligence and his determination to educate himself, despite obvious gaps in his formal training. "May I?" she asked, indicating the book. Elias handed it over with obvious reluctance, and Clara recognized the vulnerability in the gesture. Reading was clearly important to him, perhaps a connection to the wider world he had left behind, and admitting difficulty with it must have cost him considerable pride. "The problem isn't your ability," Clara said after studying the passage. "It's that this particular philosopher delights in making simple ideas as complicated as possible. Here, let me show you a technique I use with my older students." She retrieved her slate and began breaking down the sentence structure, identifying the main ideas and showing how the subordinate clauses related to the central argument. As she worked, she became aware of Elias watching her with intense concentration, not just following her explanation but studying her methods, her approach to unraveling complex thoughts. "You're a good teacher," he said when she finished. "Patient, clear. You don't make a person feel stupid for not understanding. Understanding isn't about intelligence," Clara replied. "It's about having the right tools and enough practice using them. You obviously have the intelligence, you just need more experience with this particular type of writing." What began as a single lesson evolved into a nightly routine. After their evening meal, Clara would bring out her slate and work with Elias on whatever reading had challenged him that day. Sometimes it was philosophical texts, sometimes poetry, occasionally practical manuals that used technical language unfamiliar to someone who had learned primarily through experience rather than formal education. In return, Elias began teaching Clara about the practical knowledge that sustained life in the wilderness. He showed her how to read weather patterns in cloud formations, how to identify animal tracks and predict their behavior, how to find water in country that appeared completely dry. Under his patient instruction, she learned to start fires with flint and steel, to preserve meat without salt, to recognize which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her within hours. "Education goes both ways," he said one evening as they practiced knot tying by lamplight. "Your books taught you to think, but they didn't teach you to survive. My experience taught me to survive, but it didn't always teach me to think clearly about what I was surviving for." The exchange of knowledge created an intimacy between them that Clara found both comforting and disturbing. Watching Elias struggle with complex philosophical concepts humanized him in ways that his obvious competence in practical matters never could. Seeing his face light up when he successfully passed a difficult passage, witnessing his quiet satisfaction when she mastered a wilderness skill. These moments of shared accomplishment created bonds that had nothing to do with her captivity and everything to do with genuine human connection. "You could have been a teacher yourself," Clara said one night, as they worked through a particularly challenging piece of Thoreau. "You have the patience for it, and the insight." "Different world I grew up in," Elias replied. "Teaching was for ministers and maiden ladies. Men were expected to work with their hands, make their living from the land. Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you'd had different opportunities?" Elias set down the book and stared into the fire. "Used to. Spent a lot of years thinking about all the things that might have been different if I'd made other choices, if circumstances had been different, if I'd been braver or smarter or just plain luckier. And now I try to focus on what is instead of what might have been. Regret's a luxury I can't afford." Clara studied his profile in the firelight, noting the way the shadows emphasized the strong line of his jaw, the concentration lines around his eyes. There was a peace about him that she envied, an acceptance of his circumstances that she was only beginning to understand. In her previous life, she had been constantly striving to be a better teacher, to improve her students' prospects, to prove herself worthy of respect in a community that had initially doubted her capabilities. But here in this mountain cabin, with only the immediate demands of survival and the quiet pleasure of shared learning, she was discovering a different way of being in the world. "I've been thinking about time," she said, surprising herself with the admission. How we measure it, what we think it's for. Back in Millbrook, every hour had a purpose. Every day was structured around productivity and progress. But here, time moves differently. Here, time just is. The sun rises and sets, the seasons change, but there's no artificial urgency driving everything forward. It's like being able to breathe deeply for the first time in years. Elias turned to look at her, and Clara saw understanding in his pale eyes. That's why I stayed, he said quietly. Even when I could have left, gone somewhere else, started over. This place teaches you that the important things aren't the ones you can measure on a clock. What are the important things? Peace, purpose, someone to share the quiet moments with. The last phrase hung between them, loaded with meaning that Clara wasn't sure either of them was ready to acknowledge. But she felt its truth in the warm contentment that settled over her as they sat by the fire. Slate and books scattered around them like evidence of minds meeting across the barriers of their different backgrounds. As the weeks passed, Clara found herself anticipating their evening lessons with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with educational duty and everything to do with the pleasure of Elias's company. She loved watching his face when a difficult concept suddenly became clear, loved the quiet pride he took in mastering new ideas, loved the way he asked questions that showed he was thinking deeply about what he read rather than simply absorbing information. "You're different from what I expected," she told him one night as they put away their books and prepared for sleep. "Different how? Gentler, more thoughtful. The stories people tell about you in town." "What stories?" Clara hesitated, realizing she was venturing into territory that might be painful or dangerous, but the easy intimacy of their recent conversations made her feel that honesty was possible, even necessary. "They say you killed a man, that you're dangerous, violent, that decent people should stay away from you." Elias was quiet for so long that Clara began to regret her candor, but when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "And what do you think now? After living here, seeing how I am when I'm not being watched and judged and feared, I think people are afraid of what they don't understand. And I think there's more to your story than a simple tale of violence and exile." "There always is," Elias said, "but simple tales are easier to tell, easier to believe. They don't require people to think too hard about justice and mercy, and the space between what's legal and what's right. Will you tell me the true story someday?" "Someday," he agreed, "when you're ready to hear it, when I'm ready to tell it." Clara carried that promise with her as she settled into her narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of Elias banking the fire and checking the door. The teaching slate lay on the table between their sleeping areas, marked with the night's lesson and ready for tomorrow's work. It had become a symbol of the unexpected partnership they had forged, two minds, meeting across the divide of their different worlds, finding common ground in the shared pursuit of understanding. Outside, the wind carried the scent of approaching snow, and Clara realized with a start that she had been in the mountains for nearly 2 months. Her rescue, which had once seemed inevitable, now felt increasingly remote. But as she lay in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of Elias's care and the memories of their quiet evenings together, Clara found herself wondering whether rescue was something she still wanted, or whether she was finally beginning to understand the difference between being taken and being found. The wanted poster was hidden beneath a loose floorboard near Elias's bed, discovered by accident when Clara dropped her hairbrush and watched it roll into a gap she hadn't noticed before. As she knelt to retrieve it, her fingers found the edge of something that rustled like paper, and curiosity overcame propriety as she worked the document free from its hiding place. What she found made her sink back on her heels in shock. The poster was weather-stained and creased from handling, but the image was clear enough, a younger version of Elias's face staring back at her above bold letters that read, "Wanted for murder." The text below detailed a crime that supposedly took place in Columbus, Ohio, 5 years earlier, the brutal killing of a man named Thomas Garrett, with a reward of $500 for information leading to the capture of one Elias Boone, considered armed and extremely dangerous. Clara's hands trembled as she read the details. The crime was described as particularly vicious. Garrett had been beaten to death with a blunt instrument, his body found in an alley behind the bank where he worked. Witnesses had supposedly seen Elias leaving the scene, and his disappearance immediately afterward was taken as proof of guilt. The poster warned that he should not be approached by civilians, that he was likely to be violent when cornered. For a moment, Clara felt the return of her original terror, the fear that had consumed her during those first awful hours of captivity. Here was proof that the stories whispered in Millbrook were true, that Elias Boone was indeed a dangerous fugitive who had committed the ultimate crime. But as the initial shock faded, details began to trouble her. The brutal nature of the crime described on the poster seemed incompatible with the gentle man who had nursed her through fever, who carved wooden spoons by firelight and struggled with philosophical texts in the evenings. You found it. Clara spun around to find Elias standing in the doorway, his face grim but unsurprised. She had been so absorbed in reading the poster that she hadn't heard him return from checking his traplines. "This is why you brought me here," she said, climbing to her feet with the poster still clutched in her hands. "You're a wanted man, and you thought what? That I could help you somehow? That a schoolteacher would know how to clear your name?" "No," Elias said quietly. "That's not why. Then why? Why me? Why now?" Clara felt the anger rising in her chest, all the more intense because it was mixed with the pain of betrayal. For weeks, she had been allowing herself to trust this man, to care about him, to imagine that perhaps their strange situation might develop into something meaningful. Now she was forced to confront the possibility that she had been nothing more than a pawn in some desperate criminal scheme. Elias moved slowly into the room, his hands visible and empty in a gesture she recognized as an attempt not to frighten her further. "Because you were there that night, in Millbrook, 3 months ago, when the man who really killed Thomas Garrett came through town." Clara stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "I don't understand. His name is Clayton Morse, works for the railroad now, but 5 years ago he was Thomas Garrett's business partner. They had a disagreement about some missing money, and Morse killed him for it. Made it look like robbery, but he was sloppy about covering his tracks." "That's impossible. If you knew who really committed the crime, why didn't you tell the authorities?" "Because Clayton Morse's father is Judge Harrison Morse, one of the most powerful men in Ohio. Because the evidence I had would never have been enough to convict a judge's son, especially with a convenient scapegoat already in custody. Because sometimes the law isn't about justice, it's about protecting the right people." Clara sank into a chair, the wanted poster falling from her nerveless fingers. "You were arrested? Held for questioning, would have been charged and tried and hanged, probably, if I hadn't managed to escape. Spent 2 years gathering evidence, trying to build a case that would stick. But every time I got close, Morse would move on to a new job, a new town, and I'd have to start over." "And you followed him to Millbrook?" "I followed him to Millbrook, set up camp in the mountains, watched him for weeks, waited for the right opportunity to gather the proof I needed. But he was careful, and I was running out of time. Then one night he got drunk at the saloon and started talking, bragging, really, about things he'd done, people he'd fooled. And you were there." The memory came back to Clara in a rush a night 3 months earlier, when she had stopped by the saloon to speak with the bartender about his son's poor attendance at school. A stranger had been holding court at the bar, loud and boastful with drink, entertaining the locals with stories that had seemed like harmless tall tales at the time. She remembered being uncomfortable with his crude language and violent anecdotes, but she had stayed long enough to conduct her business before hurrying back to her respectable lodgings. "He confessed," she whispered. "He actually confessed to murder, and I heard him." "You heard him? But more than that, you can identify him, testify to what he said, provide the witness account that could finally bring him to justice. Without your testimony, he walks free and I spend the rest of my life running from a crime I didn't commit. Clara felt the world shifting around her, old certainties crumbling as new understanding took their place. So you kidnapped me to force me to testify. I kidnapped you because Clayton Morse figured out what I was doing in Millbrook. He knew I was close to exposing him, and he was planning to kill you to eliminate the witness. I took you to keep you alive, not to force your cooperation. You saved my life? I tried to. I'm still trying to. Clara buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Elias was telling her. Everything she had believed about her situation was wrong. She wasn't the victim of a random crime or the target of a madman's obsession. She was a witness to murder, and the man she had come to care for was not her captor, but her protector. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked through her fingers. "Why let me think you were a criminal? Because I needed you to be safe while I figured out what to do next, and because—" Elias hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. "Because I knew that once you learned the truth, you'd want to go back and testify, and that would put you in terrible danger." Morse isn't just a killer, Clara. He's a killer with powerful connections and nothing left to lose. But I have to testify. If you're innocent, if you testify, Morse will try to kill you. Maybe before the trial, maybe after, but he'll try. And his father has resources that reach further than you can imagine. Even if we succeed in convicting him, you'll never be truly safe. Clara looked up at Elias, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since her capture. The wanted poster lay on the floor between them, its lurid accusations suddenly seeming like lies designed to protect the real criminal. This man who had carved her a wooden spoon, who had tended her through fever, who had patiently helped her understand the rhythms of wilderness life. This man was not a murderer. He was someone who had sacrificed everything in pursuit of justice, who had given up his freedom and his future to prevent an innocent woman from being killed. "The pressed flower," she said suddenly. "In the book of poetry, it wasn't for your wife, was it?" Elias shook his head. "Sarah died of fever, like I told you, but the flower I picked it the day I decided to stop running and start fighting back. Seemed like something worth remembering. And the knife, your grandfather's knife, the story it tells, is about men who stood up for what was right, even when it cost them everything. My grandfather came west because he wouldn't compromise his principles back east. My father lost his farm, defending a neighbor against false accusations, and now it's my turn to decide what kind of man I want to be." Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become her world, the peaks and valleys that had sheltered her from dangers she hadn't even known she faced. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering, promising the first real snow of the season. Soon, the passes would be closed, and they would be truly isolated until spring. The thought should have frightened her, but instead she felt something like relief. Here, in this hidden valley, she was safe from Clayton Morse and his powerful father. Here, she could think clearly about what justice really meant and what she was willing to sacrifice to achieve it. 90 days, she said, turning back to face Elias. "I've been here 90 days, and in all that time, you've treated me with nothing but kindness and respect. You could have told me the truth from the beginning, could have demanded my cooperation, could have threatened me if I refused to help. But you didn't. I couldn't, not after I got to know you, saw what kind of person you are. You deserved better than to be dragged into my fight. But I'm already in it, aren't I? I've been in it since the night I heard Clayton Morse confess to murder. The only question now is whether I'm going to hide from it or face it." Elias's pale eyes searched her face, looking for something Clara wasn't sure she could give him. "You don't have to decide now. We have all winter to think about it, to plan, to figure out the safest way forward." "No," Clara said, and felt the certainty settle over her like a warm cloak. "I don't need all winter. I need to know what happened that night in Ohio, every detail you can remember. I need to understand exactly what Clayton Morse did and how we can prove it. And then, when spring comes, I'm going back to testify. Clara, you said your grandfather's knife tells the story of men who stood up for what was right. Well, maybe it's time for that story to include a woman who did the same thing. The wanted poster lay forgotten on the floor between them, its accusations rendered meaningless by the truth that had finally been spoken. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary where justice and love could take root in the fertile soil of shared purpose and mutual respect. The quilt that Clara began sewing during the long winter nights was fashioned from scraps of both their old lives, pieces of her teaching dress sewn alongside fragments of Elias's worn work shirts, creating a pattern that spoke of two separate paths converging into something new and beautiful. As the snow deepened around their cabin and the passes became impassable, she found in the rhythmic work of needle and thread a way to process the monumental decision she had made. The truth about Elias's innocence and her own role as witness had transformed everything between them. What had begun as a relationship between captor and captive had evolved into a partnership founded on shared purpose and growing affection. But with that transformation came new complexities, new fears, and new possibilities that neither of them had anticipated. "Tell me about that night again," Clara said one evening in late December as they sat by the fire, she working on the quilt while Elias cleaned his grandfather's hunting knife. It was a conversation they had repeated dozens of times, each iteration revealing new details, new connections, new aspects of the case against Clayton Morse. "Third Thursday in June," Elias began, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who had rehearsed this testimony countless times. Morse was celebrating some business deal, buying drinks for anyone who'd listened to his stories. Started out with harmless enough tales, close calls with wild animals, clever negotiations, that sort of thing. But as the evening wore on and he got drunker, the stories got darker. Clara nodded, her needle moving steadily through the fabric as she listened. She could picture the scene clearly now, the smoky interior of the saloon, the rough men gathered around the bar, the stranger, with his expensive clothes and Eastern mannerisms, holding court like some sort of perverted preacher. "He talked about Thomas Garrett," she said, picking up the narrative thread. "Said something about business partners who got too greedy, who didn't understand the natural order of things. Some people think they can cheat a Morse and get away with it," Elias quoted. "They learn different, usually the hard way. Poor old Tommy learned real different." And then he laughed. Clara shuddered at the memory of that laugh, cold and satisfied, like a man remembering a particularly fine meal. He actually laughed about killing someone. "The laugh is what convinced me you'd be willing to testify," Elias said. "I saw your face when he made that sound. You knew you were hearing something evil, something that needed to be stopped. I should have done something that night. Should have told the sheriff what I'd heard. The sheriff would have thought you were mistaken, or making it up, or just repeating saloon gossip. Morse is good at seeming respectable when he needs to be. That's how he stayed ahead of justice for so long." Clara set down her needle and studied the portion of quilt she had completed. The pattern was beginning to emerge, a complex design that looked chaotic up close, but revealed its underlying harmony when viewed from a distance. Like their situation, she thought. What had seemed like random cruelty was actually part of a larger plan, a careful attempt to balance justice with mercy. "When we go back," she said, "what happens to us?" It was a question that had haunted both of them through the long winter evenings. They had spoken of justice, of duty, of the moral imperative to stop a killer from claiming more victims. But they had not talked about what would happen to the relationship they had built in this mountain sanctuary, or whether it could survive exposure to the harsh light of civilization. "I don't know," Elias said honestly. "If we succeed in convicting Morse, I'll be cleared of the murder charge. But there will still be questions about why I ran, why I didn't trust the law to sort things out properly. And there's the matter of taking you from Millbrook kidnapping charges, even if they're eventually dropped." And if we fail? If we fail, I go back to being a fugitive. Probably end up hanging for Garrett's murder, since bringing you back will be seen as proof of guilt rather than an attempt to seek justice. Clara reached for his hand, feeling the familiar calluses and scars that told the story of his years in exile. We won't fail. You sound very certain. I am certain. Not about the outcome. There's no guarantee that justice will prevail, no matter how right our cause might be. But I'm certain that we have to try. I'm certain that staying silent would be a betrayal of everything I believe in. Elias turned her hand in his, studying her fingers as if memorizing their shape. You could stay here, you know. After the trial, assuming I survive it. This place, it's become home in a way I never expected. And you, I've become home too. You've become everything. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, beautiful and terrifying in their implications. Clara felt her heart race as she contemplated the magnitude of what Elias was offering, not just his love, but a complete transformation of everything she had thought she wanted from life. I love you too, she said quietly. I think I've loved you since that night you nursed me through the fever, maybe even before that. But love doesn't change what we have to do. Doesn't it? We could build a life here, Clara. A good life, away from the corruption and compromise of the world below. You could teach there are families scattered through these mountains, children who need education. I could provide for us, protect us, give you a kind of peace you've never known. A life built on running from the truth? A life built on choosing love over duty to strangers. Clara understood the temptation he was offering. The winter months had shown her possibilities she had never imagined, a life of simple pleasures and genuine intimacy, free from the expectations and limitations that had always defined her existence. She had discovered that she could be happy in ways that had nothing to do with social approval or professional achievement. But she had also discovered that happiness built on injustice would never be sustainable. If we don't go back, she said carefully, Clayton Morse continues to walk free. Maybe he kills again, maybe he doesn't, but he certainly never pays for what he did to Thomas Garrett. And you never clear your name, never reclaim the honor that was stolen from you. Honor's a luxury when you're dead. No, it's not. Honor is what makes life worth living, what makes death meaningful. Your grandfather knew that when he came west. Your father knew it when he defended his neighbor. And you knew it when you spent 5 years gathering evidence instead of simply disappearing into the wilderness. Elias was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if he could read their future in the dancing flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation and something that might have been relief. Spring's still 3 months away, plenty of time to prepare, to plan, to gather what evidence we can before we leave this place. You're willing to go back? I'm willing to follow you anywhere, Clara Whitmore, even back into the world that's been hunting me for 5 years. Clara resumed her sewing, adding new pieces to the quilt that would soon cover their shared bed. Each stitch was an act of faith, a declaration that some things were worth fighting for, even when the outcome remained uncertain. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside their cabin, the fire burned warm and steady, a symbol of the light they would carry with them when they finally emerged from their mountain sanctuary to face whatever justice awaited in the world below. Tell me about the evidence, she said. Elias set down the knife and moved to a trunk in the corner of the cabin. From its depths, he retrieved a leather portfolio that Clara had never seen before, its contents carefully organized and preserved despite years of hiding and travel. Bank records, he said, spreading documents across the table. Thomas Garrett discovered that Morse had been skimming money from their construction contracts, falsifying invoices and pocketing the difference. These show the pattern payments that don't match the work done, materials charged for but never delivered. Clara studied the papers, her teacher's eye quickly grasping the systematic nature of the fraud. This is substantial evidence. Why wasn't it enough to clear you? Because Judge Morse claimed the records were forgeries, that I had created them to deflect suspicion from myself. Without Thomas alive to verify their authenticity, it became my word against a respected judge's son. But now we have my testimony about the confession. We have your testimony about what you heard in a saloon from a drunk man. Morse's lawyers will claim he was just telling tall tales, that you misunderstood or misremembered. That's why we need more. Elias pulled out another set of documents, correspondence between Morse and various business associates, telegrams that showed his movements in the weeks before and after the murder, even a photograph taken at a social gathering that placed him in Columbus on the night Thomas died. "I've spent 5 years building this case," he said, following him from town to town, documenting his pattern of fraud and violence. "Morse isn't just a killer, Clara. He's been stealing and cheating his way across the country, always staying one step ahead of the law because of his father's protection. How many others has he hurt? At least 3 that I can prove. Men who discovered his schemes and threatened to expose him. All died in accidents or robberies that were never properly investigated." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. The man she had heard bragging in the Millbrook saloon wasn't just a murderer, he was a serial killer whose crimes had been covered up by judicial corruption. Her testimony wouldn't just vindicate Elias, it could save future victims. "We'll need a lawyer," she said. "Someone honest, someone with the courage to take on Judge Morse and his political connections." "I know someone, Jacob Stern in Denver. He's been following the case, believes in my innocence, even when the evidence was thinner than it is now. If anyone can present our case effectively, it's him." "And what about protection? If Morse realizes we're coming forward, he already knows. Why do you think the passes are being watched? I've seen the signs, tracks that don't belong, movements in the forest that aren't wildlife. Morse has men looking for us, probably has had them out there since the first snowfall." Clara set down her needle, the quilt suddenly forgotten. "They're watching us now?" "Not closely. The snow makes it difficult, and they don't know exactly where we are. But come spring, when the trail's clear, they'll be waiting. Then how do we get out? How do we reach civilization alive?" Elias smiled grimly, and Clara caught a glimpse of the tactical mind that had kept him alive through 5 years of pursuit. "Very carefully, and with a plan that uses their expectations against them." Over the following weeks, as winter tightened its grip on the mountains, Elias and Clara developed their strategy. They would leave earlier than anyone expected, while snow still blocked most of the high passes, but before the watchers had taken their positions. They would take a route that led east rather than south, toward Denver instead of back to Montana, avoiding the obvious paths that Morse's men would be monitoring. "It means abandoning most of our supplies," Elias warned. "Traveling light and fast, with only what we can carry on our backs. It'll be dangerous, especially if we hit a late storm. More dangerous than staying here until Morse decides to come after us himself." "No, you're right. By spring, he'll be desperate enough to risk a direct assault. Better to leave on our terms than wait for him to dictate the conditions." Clara added the final stitches to their quilt on a February evening, when the wind screamed like a living thing around the cabin walls. The finished piece was beautiful, a complex pattern that told the story of 2 lives interweaving, separate colors, blending into something richer and more complete than either had been alone. "It's ready," she said, spreading the quilt across their bed. "Like us?" Clara looked at Elias across the cabin that had become their sanctuary, this man who had risked everything to protect her and who was now preparing to risk everything again in pursuit of justice. He was reading by lamplight, his weathered features softened by the golden glow, his pale eyes focused on words that would help him articulate the truth when their moment came. "Yes," she said, "like us, ready to face whatever comes next, together." The quilt would stay behind when they left too bulky for the desperate journey ahead, too precious to risk losing on mountain trails. But it would remain as a testament to the love they had found in this unlikely place, a symbol of the home they had built together even as they prepared to leave it behind. 3 weeks later, On a morning when the wind had finally stilled and the snow had stopped falling, Clara woke to find Elias already dressed and checking their supplies. The time had come. Their mountain sanctuary had sheltered them through the long winter of planning and preparation, but now spring was stirring in the valleys below, and justice was calling them back to the world they had left behind. "Are you ready?" he asked, shouldering his pack. Clara took one last look around the cabin that had been prison, sanctuary, and home. Then she picked up her father's Bible, the one artifact she would carry into the uncertain future, and nodded. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Clara's father's Bible felt heavier than its actual weight as she gripped it in the witness box, its familiar leather binding worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. The courthouse in Denver was packed beyond capacity, with standing room crowds spilling into the hallways and reporters from newspapers as far away as Chicago, taking notes on every word. The case had captured the nation's attention, a story of corruption, murder, and one woman's courage that resonated far beyond the specifics of Colorado territorial law. Judge Morrison was a stern man with intelligent eyes who had already demonstrated his commitment to justice by agreeing to hear the case despite pressure from powerful interests. He had reviewed all the evidence during pre-trial hearings and declared that Clara's testimony would be crucial to determining the truth about Thomas Garrett's death 5 years earlier. "Miss Whitmore," said Jacob Stern, the defense attorney who had traveled from Denver to represent Elias, "please tell the court about the evening of June 15th, when you encountered the defendant Clayton Morse in the Millbrook saloon." Clara took a breath and began the testimony she had rehearsed through the long winter nights. Her voice was steady as she described the scene, the crowded saloon, the drunken stranger holding court, the increasingly dark nature of his stories as the evening progressed. "He spoke of business partners," she continued, "and how some people didn't understand what he called the natural order of things. Then he mentioned someone named Tommy, and he said—" Clara paused. Feeling the weight of the moment, he said, "Poor old Tommy learned real different," and then he laughed. "What kind of laugh was it, Miss Whitmore?" "Cold, satisfied, like someone remembering something that gave them pleasure. It was the laugh of a man who had enjoyed causing pain." Across the courtroom, Clayton Morse sat beside his expensive legal team, his face a mask of wounded innocence. He was a handsome man in his 30s, well-dressed and carefully groomed, exactly the sort of person who could charm his way out of trouble under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and Clara could see the strain showing around his eyes as her testimony built the case against him. "Miss Whitmore," continued Stern, "in your professional opinion, as an educator who has observed human behavior for many years, did Mr. Morse appear to be telling tall tales, or was he confessing to actual crimes?" "Objection," called the prosecution attorney. "The witness is not qualified to make such determinations." "Sustained," ruled Judge Morrison. "The jury will disregard that question." But Clara had seen the impact of her words on the faces of the 12 men who would decide Elias's fate. They were frontier folk, practical people who understood the difference between harmless bragging and something darker. Her description of Morse's laugh had clearly disturbed them. Stern moved on to the documents, the bank records, the correspondence, the careful trail of evidence that Elias had assembled over 5 years of investigation. Clara was able to verify several key points, explaining how her own observations of Morse's behavior correlated with the financial crimes detailed in the paperwork. "Finally, Miss Whitmore, I must ask about your relationship with the accused, Elias Boone. Is it true that you lived with him for over 100 days in his mountain cabin?" "It is true." "And during that time, did he ever threaten you, harm you, or treat you with anything less than complete respect?" "Never. Mr. Boone treated me with kindness and consideration at all times. He saved my life when I became ill with mountain fever, and he protected me from dangers I didn't even know existed." "In your opinion, is Elias Boone capable of the brutal murder that Mr. Morse stands accused of?" "Absolutely not. Elias Boone is a man of honor and integrity who risked everything in pursuit of justice. He is incapable of the kind of violence that killed Thomas Garrett. When the prosecution's turn came, they attacked Clara's testimony with the ferocity of lawyers fighting for a powerful client's freedom. They questioned her memory, her motives, her moral character. They suggested that she had fallen in love with her captor and would say anything to protect him. They painted her as a naive spinster who had misunderstood harmless tavern talk and constructed an elaborate fantasy to justify her inappropriate relationship with a fugitive. "Miss Whitmore," said the lead prosecutor, a thin man with calculating eyes, "isn't it true that you were a lonely woman, past the usual age of marriage, desperate for any kind of romantic attention?" "I was content with my life as it was," Clara replied firmly. "Content enough to abandon your students and your responsibilities without a word of explanation. I didn't abandon anyone. I was taken against my will to protect me from a killer." "So you claim, but isn't it true that you could have escaped at any time during those long months in the mountains, that you stayed because you wanted to stay?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I stayed because leaving would have meant death, either from the wilderness or from the men who were hunting me. Mr. Boone explained the dangers clearly, and I chose to trust his judgment." "His judgment, or your feelings for him?" "Both," Clara said, and saw surprise flicker across the prosecutor's face. "I did come to care for Elias Boone during our time together. But that doesn't change what I heard Clayton Morse confess to in that saloon. It doesn't alter the facts of the case or the truth about who really killed Thomas Garrett." The cross-examination continued for hours, with the prosecution trying every angle to discredit Clara's testimony. But she held firm, grounded by the weight of her father's Bible and the knowledge that justice was more important than her personal comfort or reputation. When court recessed for the day, Clara found herself surrounded by reporters shouting questions. How did it feel to be kidnapped? Had she really fallen in love with her captor? What was life like in the wilderness? The questions felt invasive and irrelevant, focused on sensation rather than the serious matter of murder and justice. Elias appeared at her side, his presence immediately calming the chaos. He didn't speak to the reporters, but his protective stance and steady gaze made it clear that Clara was under his protection. Together, they pushed through the crowd toward the hotel, where they were staying under guard. "How do you think it went?" Clara asked once they were safely in their room. "You were magnificent," Elias said. "Honest, steady, convincing. If we lose, it won't be because you failed to tell the truth clearly. And if we win? If we win, Clayton Morse goes to prison for the rest of his life, and I get to clear my name. We get to start fresh, build a life together without looking over our shoulders." Clara moved to the window and looked out at the busy Denver street below. The world seemed impossibly complex after their months of mountain simplicity, full of noise and hurry and complications she had almost forgotten existed. But somewhere in that complexity was the possibility of justice, the hope that truth would prevail over power and corruption. "Tomorrow Morse testifies," she said. "Tomorrow we find out if 5 years of running and hiding and gathering evidence was worth it." Clara opened her father's Bible to a passage she had marked years earlier. "The truth shall make you free." The words seemed to shimmer on the page, a promise that had sustained her through the darkest moments of doubt. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, she had done what was right. She had spoken the truth, defended the innocent, and stood up to power despite the personal cost. The rest was in God's hands, and the hands of 12 Colorado citizens who would decide whether justice was stronger than corruption, whether truth was more powerful than influence, whether a schoolteacher's testimony could bring down a judge's son and free a man who had spent 5 years paying for someone else's crime. Elias's mother's wedding ring had traveled from Ohio to the Colorado mountains and finally to this Denver courthouse, where it now rested in his palm like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He had carried it for 5 years, through every mile of exile and every night of loneliness, keeping it safe for a future that had seemed impossible until Clara Whitmore walked into his life. The jury had been deliberating for 6 hours, and tension in the courthouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clayton Morse had testified in his own defense, presenting himself as a successful businessman who had been the victim of a disturbed man's elaborate frame-up. He was smooth, confident, and completely convincing until Jacob Stern had begun his cross-examination. Under pressure, cracks had appeared in Morse's carefully constructed story. He couldn't explain why Elias would have chosen him specifically to frame, couldn't account for several discrepancies in his testimony, and became visibly agitated when confronted with the bank records that showed his pattern of fraud. Most damaging of all, when asked directly about the night in the Millbrook saloon, he had claimed no memory of the evening, despite multiple witnesses placing him there. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Stern had said in his closing argument, "we have before us 2 men. One who ran when falsely accused because he knew the deck was stacked against him, who spent 5 years gathering evidence to prove his innocence, rather than simply disappearing into the wilderness. The other is a man whose response to being exposed was to plan the murder of an innocent woman, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time to hear him brag about killing his business partner." The prosecution had countered with their own compelling narrative. A violent fugitive who had kidnapped and brainwashed a lonely schoolteacher, convincing her to perjure herself to support his desperate lies. They painted Elias as a master manipulator who had exploited Clara's isolation and vulnerability, turning her into an unwitting accomplice in his scheme to escape justice. But Clara had been magnificent on the stand. Even under brutal cross-examination, she had remained calm, consistent, and utterly convincing. Her testimony had the ring of truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could disguise, and Elias had seen its impact on the jury's faces. "They're taking a long time," Clara said, settling beside him on the courthouse bench where they waited for the verdict. "Good cases take time to consider properly," Elias replied, though his own nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Better they think it through carefully than rush to a decision they might regret. "What happens if—" Clara began, then stopped herself. "If they convict me, I hang for Thomas Garrett's murder, and you go back to your teaching with a scandal attached to your name that will follow you for the rest of your life." "I don't care about the scandal. I know you don't. That's one of the things I love most about you." Elias opened his hand to reveal the wedding ring, its simple gold band worn thin by years of wear. "This was my mother's. She wore it for 37 years, through good times and hard times, through sickness and health, through everything that marriage can throw at 2 people. Clara stared at the ring, understanding its significance immediately. "Elias, I know this isn't the time or place for romantic gestures. I know we're sitting in a courthouse waiting to find out if I'm going to hang for murder. But I also know that if the jury finds me guilty, I'll never get another chance to ask you properly." "Ask me what?" "To marry me. To build a life together, whatever kind of life that turns out to be. To take a chance on happiness, even when the world seems determined to deny it to us." Clara took the ring from his palm, feeling its weight and warmth. "You're asking me to marry you in a courthouse corridor while waiting for a murder verdict? I'm asking you to marry me because I love you more than I've ever loved anything or anyone in my life. Because these past months with you have been the happiest I've ever known, despite everything that brought us together. Because if there's any chance at all for a future, I want to spend it with you. And if there's no future, if the jury convicts you, then at least I'll know," I asked. "At least I'll go to the gallows knowing that I told you how I feel." Before Clara could respond, the courthouse doors opened and the bailiff stepped out. "Jury's reached a verdict," he announced. "Court will reconvene in 10 minutes. Elias and Clara looked at each other, the weight of the moment settling over them like a heavy blanket. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, would be decided in the next few minutes by 12 strangers who held their fate in their hands. "Yes," Clara said quietly. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Whether the jury convicts you or acquits you, whether we have 50 years together or 50 minutes, my answer is yes." Elias slipped the ring onto her finger, and for just a moment, the courthouse corridor faded away. There was only Clara, only the promise they were making to each other, only the love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances into something strong enough to withstand whatever judgment awaited them. Inside the courtroom, Judge Morrison called for order as the jury filed in. The foreman was a weathered man who had spent his life working with his hands, exactly the sort of person who would understand the difference between justice and legal convenience. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" asked the judge. "We have, Your Honor, in the matter of the People versus Clayton Morse, on the charge of murder in the first degree. How do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. Spectators cheered or shouted depending on their sympathies, and Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order. But Elias heard none of it. He heard only the second part of the verdict, the part that would determine his own fate. In the matter of the People versus Elias Boone on the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? "We find the defendant not guilty." This time the chaos was even louder, but it was a joyful chaos. 5 years of exile were over. 5 years of running and hiding and carrying the weight of false accusations had finally come to an end. Elias was a free man, cleared of all charges, able to reclaim his name and his place in the world. Clara threw her arms around him, and he lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in the midst of the celebrating crowd. She was crying and laughing at the same time, overwhelmed by relief and joy and the sudden reality that their impossible love story had somehow found its happy ending. "It's over," she whispered against his ear. "It's finally over." "No," Elias said, setting her down but keeping her close. "It's just beginning." The ring on Clara's finger caught the light from the courthouse windows, a symbol of promises made and kept, of love that had survived the worst circumstances and emerged stronger. Clayton Morse was being led away in chains, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Judge Morse's political influence had finally met its match in the form of 12 honest citizens who valued truth over power. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to celebrate the verdict. Elias and Clara emerged to cheers and applause, to questions from reporters and congratulations from strangers who had followed the case in the newspapers. But they only had eyes for each other, for the future that stretched ahead of them like an uncharted country full of possibilities. "Where do we go now?" Clara asked, as they pushed through the crowd toward their waiting carriage. "Home," Elias said, "wherever that turns out to be, as long as we're together." The wedding ring gleamed on Clara's finger, a circle of gold that connected past to future, binding two hearts that had found each other against all odds. Justice had been served, love had triumphed, and somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, a quilt waited on an empty bed, ready to welcome them home. The new school bell rang clear and true across the mountain valley, its bronze voice carrying the promise of education and hope to children who had never imagined such opportunities might exist in their remote corner of Colorado. Clara stood on the porch of the one-room schoolhouse that Elias had built for her, watching her students file in for their morning lessons with the same sense of purpose that had once driven her work in Millbrook, but tempered now by the wisdom that comes from understanding what truly matters in life. 6 months had passed since the trial, 6 months of building a new life together in the mountains they both loved. They had returned to Elias's cabin as husband and wife, finding the quilt still spread across their bed, like a testament to the love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. But they had not stayed isolated. Word of their story had spread through the scattered communities of the high country, and families had begun bringing their children for instruction, eager to provide their young ones with the education that Clara offered. "Mrs. Boone," called young Timothy Fletcher as he scrambled up the schoolhouse steps, his lunch pail bouncing against his leg. "Did you really live with Indians before you married Mr. Boone?" Clara smiled at the boy's confusion, understanding how the adults' whispered conversations about her unconventional courtship had been transformed in children's imaginations into something even more exotic. "No, Timothy. I lived in a cabin in the mountains, learning about wilderness life from your new schoolmaster. But Mr. Henderson says you were captured by outlaws and held for ransom." "Mr. Henderson is mistaken," Clara said gently. "Sometimes adults don't understand the whole story, so they make up parts that seem to make sense to them. That's why education is so important. It teaches us to think carefully about what we hear and to seek the truth for ourselves." The boy nodded solemnly and hurried inside to take his seat. Clara followed, pausing in the doorway to appreciate the sight of 16 children from ages 6 to 14, all eager to learn despite the long distances many had traveled to reach the school. Some came on horseback, others on foot, a few in wagons driven by parents who understood the value of what Clara was offering their children. The schoolhouse itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, built by Elias with the same care and attention to detail that characterized everything he created. The windows were positioned to catch the best light, the stove was perfectly sized to heat the space without overwhelming it, and every piece of furniture had been made specifically for its purpose. On the wall behind Clara's desk hung a small framed motto that read, "The truth shall make you free," words from her father's Bible that had guided her through the most difficult period of her life. "Good morning, children," Clara said, moving to ring the new bell that called her students to order. The sound was different from the old brass bell in Millbrook, clearer, sweeter, full of promise for the future rather than weight from the past. "Good morning, Mrs. Boone," the children chorused back, and Clara felt the familiar warmth of purpose settle over her like a comfortable shawl. The morning lessons flowed with practiced ease, but Clara found herself thinking about the letter she had received the previous week from Margaret in Philadelphia. Her cousin had written with amazement about the newspaper accounts of the trial, expressing wonder that quiet Clara Whitmore had become the heroine of such a dramatic story. More importantly, Margaret had included a clipping from an educational journal that discussed Clara's innovative methods of mountain education, praising her work with isolated children and suggesting that her approach might serve as a model for other frontier communities. "You've become famous," Margaret had written. "There are people here who would very much like to meet you, to learn from your experiences. The Academy is prepared to offer you a position that would allow you to develop your methods on a larger scale, perhaps even write a book about frontier education. You could have influence, Clara, real influence on educational policy." Clara had shown the letter to Elias that evening as they sat by their fire. The letter that represented everything she had once thought. She wanted recognition, influence, the chance to make a difference on a scale larger than one small schoolhouse. "What do you think?" he had asked after reading it carefully. "I think Margaret still doesn't understand what I've learned about the difference between making a difference and making a difference that matters." "And what's the difference?" "The difference is sitting in our schoolhouse every morning, learning to read and write and think. The difference is young Sarah Morrison discovering that she loves mathematics, or Peter Fletcher realizing that he wants to study law. The difference is individual children whose lives are changed because someone took the time to teach them properly." Elias had smiled and pulled her closer. "So we're staying? We're staying. This is where we belong, where our work matters most." Now, watching her students work through their arithmetic problems with the focused concentration that spoke of genuine learning taking place, Clara knew she had made the right choice. Fame and influence were appealing abstractions, but education was concrete, immediate, transformative, in ways that could be measured in young minds opened to new possibilities. After school that afternoon, Clara walked home through the aspens that were just beginning to turn gold with autumn's touch. The path wound past the stream where she and Elias had first talked about books and learning, past the meadow where he had taught her to identify edible plants, past all the landmarks of their unconventional courtship that had somehow led to the deepest happiness either of them had ever known. Elias was waiting on the porch, whittling a piece of pine into what looked like it would become another school supply. His grandfather's hunting knife moved with sure strokes, shaping the wood with the same patience he brought to everything he created. "How were the children today?" he asked as Clara settled beside him. "Wonderful. Timothy Fletcher asked if I had lived with Indians, and Sarah Morrison solved 3 algebra problems without help. I think we may have a future mathematician on our hands, or a future teacher. She has your way of thinking through problems methodically." Clara leaned against Elias's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the quiet contentment that had become the foundation of their days together. "I had another letter from the Territorial Education Board. They want to visit next month to observe our methods and possibly recommend them for other mountain communities. More recognition for the famous Mrs. Boone. More opportunities to help other children get the education they deserve. That's what matters." Elias set down his carving and pulled Clara closer. "Have I told you today that I love you? Only 3 times. You're falling behind your usual schedule. I love you, Clara Boone. I love the way you make learning into an adventure for those children. I love the way you see possibilities where other people see only obstacles. I love the way you chose truth over comfort, justice over safety, love over everything that seemed reasonable and sensible." Clara turned in his arms to face him fully. "I love you too, Elias Boone. I love the way you built me a schoolhouse more beautiful than any I ever imagined. I love the way you listen to my stories about the children, as if they're the most important news in the world. I love the way you showed me that home isn't a place, it's wherever the people you love are waiting for you." They sat together on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered their love, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the wind sang through the pines with the voice of wilderness that Clara had learned to hear as music. In the schoolhouse, the new bell waited silently for tomorrow's lessons, ready to call another generation of mountain children to learn about the wider world while remaining rooted in the values of their community. On the desk, Clara's teaching slate bore the marks of the day's lessons, and her father's Bible lay open to the passage that had guided her through the darkness into light. The quilt they had sewn together during that long winter of preparation still covered their bed, its complex pattern telling the story of 2 separate lives that had found each other against all odds and chosen to weave their futures together. And on Clara's finger, Elias's mother's wedding ring caught the lamplight, a circle of gold that connected them to the past while promising a future full of love, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from work that truly matters. Sometimes the person who changes your life forever is indeed the last one you'd ever expect to love. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, that unexpected love turns out to be exactly what you needed all along, not just to be happy, but to become the person you were always meant to be. In the mountains of Colorado, where the air was thin and the silence was deep, Clara and Elias Boone had found something more precious than gold. They had found home in each other, purpose in their shared work, and the kind of love that makes even the most impossible dreams seem suddenly, beautifully, inevitably real.